Great.
Yes, we can start. So, hey everyone, my name is Elena, and I'm a curator of Typography Center of Contemporary Art in Krasnodar, where the laboratory Experiences Art is presenting right now. And I'm happy to see you here online and offline. And I want to give a word to Lika Caron, the organizer of this laboratory.
Thank you, Elena. Hello, everyone. My name is Lika Caron, and I'm in Krasnodar now too at Typography Contemporary Art Center. I'm a curator of our educational program, which is called Experience as Art. And in that program, we try to explore the potentials of classical aesthetics in contemporary art scene. We see it, we explore aesthetics in relation to metaphysical problems such as space and time. And today we are having the second lecture, the second public event of our laboratory, which is a lecture. Jean-Pierre Caron is given a lecture which is called On the Equality of All Minds. I'll just read the abstract of the talk. The final chapter of Reza Negarestani's Intelligence and Spirit proposes a concept of philosophy as a program for the unfolding of the thesis of the equality of all minds, mobilizing among other theoretical elements Goodman's idea of world making. This presentation aims at compatibilizing world making as proposed by Negarestani with a different set of preoccupations proposed by Jean-Pierre's friend and collaborator Gabriel Tupinambá in his Freeing Thought from Thinkers essay. Within this resides a shift of focus from philosophy as the organ of world-making to concrete organizational practice, which shall enable us to ask the question, consistent with the life-forming project Jean-Pierre has been pursuing. What does world making look like from inside worlds? Jean-Pierre Caron is a philosopher and artist based in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. He is an associate professor of philosophy at the UFRG. He's also been practicing noise and experimental music for more than 15 years, and he manages with his friends his own label, Seminal Records. He's also a former member of the Circle of Studies of the Idea and Ideology, which is a political collective dedicated to experiments in organization. So please, JP, start.
Hello, thank you for the invitation. Some people who are here have seen my last course in the New Center, and they will recognize some tropes from that course. I'll just address this very briefly. Of course, the comparison between Reza Negarestani's text and Gabriel Tupinambá's text was already there, but there will be some new conclusions regarding this. So it's not really the same, okay? Even if there are a couple of materials that are common to that endeavor as well. Yeah, I have a PowerPoint, so I'll just share my screen, right, and start right away. Just a sec. Opa, I can't really share screen. Can you enable that to me? Just, okay. Let me open my presentation. Is screen sharing enabled? 'Cause, 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 'c Yeah, it is. It's working. Can you see this? You are muted, Lika.
Yeah. Yes, we can see this, and we can see the interface of your program. So we can make it.
Thank you. So yeah, I have a few slides here that will shape this this discussion that I want to have. It is not directly. Also, this is maybe another disclaimer I should provide. It is not directly connected to the problem of art. I see you are, of course, engaged in art making and philosophical reflection on art, but in the section dedicated to the questions, I can try to connect the dots regarding also different what we call truth procedures here. I will be talking mainly about philosophy and politics, but we can maybe connect it to art practice in some way as well. As Lika said, I'm also an artist. So okay. So this is called On the Equality of All Minds, and it is based on a couple of different projects. One is, of course, the last chapter of Reza Negarestani's big book, Intelligence and Spirit, where he defends the thesis of philosophy as a program of, dedicated to the unfolding of this equality, right? For Reza, the deep ethical project with which philosophy is concerned has to do with this unfolding of this equality of all minds, right? And the second one is a project from a collaborator, Gabriel Tupinambá, also a philosopher and psychoanalyst, that is called Freeing Thought from Thinkers. There's a paper with this title, Freeing Thought from Thinkers. So just from the titles that I've chosen, you can see a certain kind of connection, like the idea of thought as a means of unfolding a certain forms of equality. And this equality also manifests itself not as tethered to the individual thinker. It is like the constitution of a certain form of thought that is trans-individual, is not only individual. This is a background question that is orienting this comparison, this compatibilization, as I said in my abstract. Okay, so let's dive right in. The final chapter of Reza Negarestani's Intelligence and Spirit is the unfolding of the idea of philosophy as a program that starts from the thesis of the equality of all minds. So here's a quote. The central thesis of this final chapter is that philosophy is, at its deepest level, a collection of action principles and practices or operations which involve realizabilities, i.e. what can possibly be brought about by a specific category of properties or forms, and that to properly define philosophy and to highlight its significance, we should approach philosophy by first examining its programmatic nature. This means that rather than starting the inquiry into the nature of philosophy by asking, what is philosophy trying to say? What does it really mean? What is its application? Does it have any relevance? We should ask, what sort of program is philosophy? How does it function? What are its operational effects? What realizabilities specific to each forms does it elaborate? And finally, as a program, what kinds of experimentation does it involve? So experimentation will be a crucial word here, because the main issue, the main issue of the comparison between Reza's text and Gabriel's text resides in this problem of experimentation. While Reza is talking about a kind of philosophical experimentation with concepts, with ways of understanding the world, which we can understand through Nelson Goodman's lenses as world making, okay? So we can come up with different sets of logical understandings that might compose different worlds. You people who are studying philosophy of art might be familiar with this thesis by Nelson Goodman, that we are always enmeshed in worlds that are products of our own symbolizing activities, artistic activities, scientific activities, and all that, okay? while Reza is interested in this kind of experimentation, there is also a kind of practical experimentation that politics needs, asks us to do, in a sense. So this is what I'm calling the organizational point of view that Gabriel is putting forward in his text. Like, what kinds of organizations of people, prima facie, are able to put forward and unfold a certain form of immanent thinking, a thinking that is immanent to the organization itself. There's a bunch of philosophical problems involved in that. So what I intend to come up with is a certain form of filtering. I'm going to filter Reza through Gabriel and Gabriel through Reza in order to come up with my own version of this, okay? This is the basic idea. So a set of related philosophies here, a program that has operational effects upon the one philosophizing. This presentation aims at uncovering some possible effects of philosophy, particularly as it partakes political thinking. A set of related problems will emerge from Reza's thesis that connect the idea of world making that he takes from Nelson Goodman, forms of life that I take from Wittgenstein, which Wittgenstein thinks of as a kind of ground for practices of meaning, and the possibility of reflexively applying world-making practices to one's own form of life. So 3 elements here, like right in the beginning, you have like the idea of world-making, the refashioning of worlds out of, you know, sense contents and logical unfoldings. We can create our worlds, okay? Second element, forms of life. Wittgenstein is not a foundationalist philosopher, which means he's not interested in telling us about the essence, eternal essence of the world or something like that. He's always relativizing what we can talk about the world to the forms of life that we are enmeshed in, okay? So there is a problem with foundation there. If we are always already living in multiple worlds that are the product of our own symbolizing practices, and if our start is already a world in the guise of a form of life that gives meaning to our world-making practices, what about the refashioning of the form of life itself? Does it yield a kind of Abgrund, like unfoundationalist gesture, like the absence of foundation, or are we destroying the ground upon which we can build other worlds? There's a bunch of different questions that different philosophers can, try to account for, relating this kind of self-reflective refashioning of worlds, okay? So this is the third issue, reflexively applying world-making practice to one's own form of life. So this reflexivity is, in a sense, the object of the present investigation. In order to examine the possible political tractions of such endeavor, in the later part of this presentation, we will engage with the work of Gabriel Tupinambá that dislodges the problem of life forming, as I call it, to concrete organizational practice. Okay, let's go. So Goodman's world-making ideal, very quickly consider, this is a quote from Ways of World-Making, Goodman's Ways of World-Making, sorry. Consider to begin with the statements, the sun always moves and the sun never moves, which, though equally true, are at odds with each other. Shall we say then that they describe different worlds, and indeed that there are as many different worlds as there are such mutually exclusive truths? Rather, we are inclined to regard the two strings of words not as complete statements with truth values of their own, but as elliptical for some such statements as, under frame of reference A, the sun always moves, and under frame of reference B, the sun never moves. Statements that may both be true of the same world. Frames of reference, though, seem to belong less to what is described than to systems of description, and each of the two statements relates to what is described to what is described in such a system. If I ask about the world, you can offer to tell me how it is under one or more frames of reference. But if I insist that you tell me how it is apart from all frames, what can you say? We are confined to ways of describing whatever is described. So this is basically the basic idea of world making, not so much as an ideal to be pursued, but as a matter of factual element of our ways of understanding. Really, we can't really understand anything without a frame of reference, without a kind of a set of assumptions, theoretical assumptions that will give meaning to what we are understanding. Okay, and this set of assumptions, in the last instance, would come from a certain form of life in my understanding, which is this Wittgensteinian notion. Like, it doesn't come directly from the world; it comes from a world that is partially constructed through the form of life that we inhabit. Okay, so for Goodman, we are always already living worlds of our own making, which would maybe render my question of world making applied to one's world a false issue. In the second part of this presentation, I hope to reformulate the question in a way that shows its cogency. Okay. So, okay. So this is Reza's formulation of the thesis of the equality of all minds. Philosophy begins with a universal thesis regarding the equality of all minds, that whoever or whatever satisfies the basic conditions of its possibility should be seen as and treated as equal in the broadest possible sense. But as the discipline of philosophizing becomes more mature, it ought to realize that there is, in fact, a significant truth to these accusations of philosophy as a Western, self-entitled mode of thinking. I think there's a better way. This is kind of bugging me. Yeah, presentation. This is the best thing. Where is it? Yeah. Okay, better. So just a second. Take this out. Yeah, better. So philosophy begins with a universal thesis regarding the equality of all minds. Okay, that whoever or whatever satisfies the basic conditions of its possibility should be seen as and treated as equal in the broadest possible sense. But as the discipline of philosophizing becomes more mature, it ought to realize that there is, in fact, a significant truth to these accusations of philosophy as a Western self-entitled mode of thinking, however ill-judged they may seem. The equality of minds as a thesis about what is true and what is just is a dictum universal and necessary in its truth and applicability. But that does not mean that it is concretely universal for us. It is something to be achieved and concretely instituted. The condition of the equality of all minds is one whose recognition and realization demands struggle and a constant campaign against the prevalent systems of exploitation. But insofar as exploitation is that which obscures this equality, can only be challenged by attending to the questions of what we ought to think and what we ought to do, by committing to and elaborating the primary datum of philosophy, i.e. that thinking is possible, that we can begin to fight the condition of exploitation. So the primary focus of this cognitive program is to methodically compel thinking to identify and bring about its realizabilities, namely what arises from the exercise of its theoretical and practical powers, and to explore what can possibly come out of thinking and what thought as an act and as the object of its act can become. As will be argued, it is within the overarching scope of this cognitive program that philosophy's thesis of the equality of all minds can be concretely elaborated as an emancipatory project. So the way Reza works through this thesis is to elaborate a set of what he calls data, or datum, plural for datum, right? Data. But these data are not really givens. His idea is that they are truth candidates. They are axioms for further experimentation in thought. So what I will bring, what we'll bring from the second part of this presentation is a certain experimentation in practice, which might be different from what we can come up with by this axiomatic method of experimenting in thought that Reza comes up with. So the idea here is that data are truth candidates by themselves. I'm reading the bold part here of the quote. As mentioned, data are truth candidates by themselves, individually have no truth significance. They instead permit the instantiation of a logical space that encompasses them all. The criterion of plausibility of each datum, rather than its truth, is determined by how it hangs together with other data within this logical space. This is the coherentist web of data, a system of semantic transparency or coherence. It is only through the coherency analysis of this network that truth candidates can be added, revised, or subtracted. More importantly, the navigation of this coherentist network or logical space is exactly the process of construction and exploration that has a truth indicative weight. In a system built on the basis of a series of truth givens, cognitive labors cumulatively moves outward, both through and at the expense of the security afforded by its fundaments. In the coherentist network, instead, the direction of orientation is inward, moving contractively from the boundaries roughly demarcated by the network of insecure candidates. Like, we don't really know what is the truth value of such candidates. They are candidates for truth, for being true, but we don't really know. They are hypotheses, experimental hypotheses for thought. Okay, so you have to move outward, inward, from the bounds that are formed by these candidates, okay, to a more determined domain of truth. In the course of this inward navigation, sometimes the boundaries of the system will have to be readjusted to accommodate additional truth candidates or to discard some of the existing ones. So within these several data that Reza uses in his final chapter of the book, there are two that interest me more than the others for the purposes of this presentation. One of them is datum 2, which is Reza's appropriation of world making, Goodman's world making. So this datum says, in its quintessential form, philosophy is an organon of world building. So the worlds crafted by philosophy, depending on their methodological integration with local modes of thinking, science, politics, arts, etc., can be either abstract or concrete, while being a theoretical approach of philosophy, Reza talks about concrete modes of thinking that, in a sense, recovers Badiouian truth procedures, which will be an element of Gabriel's approach. In datum 2, he offers a description of some of the principal techniques of world making offered by Nelson Goodman. So there's this different data that Reza puts forward. One of them is, in its quintessential form, philosophy is an organon of world building. So Reza retrieves from Goodman 5 different theses of world making. So 1, every world we make is built on the resources and detritus of the available worlds. Every making is a remaking. That is to say, there is a continuity between built worlds and existing worlds. Built worlds, however, are not fantasy worlds or mere possible worlds begotten by the arcane imagination of a staunch advocate of model realism. They are actual worlds. Second, there are only world versions whose criteria of rightness should be tested in the context of their frame of reference, coherency, veracity, and validity, or conforming to the rules of inference, range of possible applications, reconciliation, or its absence, i.e. conflict between worlds. This means that built worlds cannot be assessed by way of an indiscriminate reduction to an original or fundamental world. Once properly understood, reduction is an enrichment of reality and a way of world building, not a unique method or a recourse to some precursor world or total foundation. Third, under rigorous scrutiny, the common sense distinction between pluralism and monism, many worlds and one world, disappears. What is considered to be one world can be made up of many contrasting, even incommensurable aspects. And what are taken to be many worlds can be seen as one under a specific mode of integration or a collection of those worlds into a single unitary set. Fourth, making new worlds for the sake of multiplicity and diversification is a craftsman caprice. The choice of alternatives or the attempt to envision and construct alternatives is not by any means reflective of reality. All alternatives are beholden to the criteria of rightness, the procedures by which false alternatives can be distinguished from those which are right, fit, and testable. Even different aspects of one world can be turned into alternatives There is no mandate to imagine or make new worlds. Ways of world making are inherently ways of knowing and are therefore intrinsically sensitive to the principles required for knowing and explaining things. And in the fifth thesis, he rehearses the specific techniques Goodman talks about. So behind all ways of world making, there lies an ever-growing list of methods and operations, such basic operations for propagation of worlds. So I won't get in the details here. I don't think we need them, but I'll just list the different techniques that Goodman talks about. Composition and decomposition. B, weighting, that assigns a different weight to a different part of a world, turning it into another world. Ordering, deletion and supplementation, which is quite interesting, which is has to do with how to say that, a cutoff of certain part of the world, and something that is added, deletion and supplementation. Deformation, which is the fifth. Okay, so the world of philosophy is a universe of worlds in Reza's understanding. Its philosophical tenets are experimentations in crafting worlds and their intelligent inhabitants, which, upon careful analysis, can be shown to consist of one world and one universal conception of intelligence, an intelligence that demarcates the necessary ontological and epistemological correlations between what is intelligible and the work involved in making sense of it as a part of an intelligible reality or being. To this extent, the new worlds of intelligence are not just cognized worlds, they are fundamentally the world recognized in different ways. So there is for Reza this universe of worlds that has to do with a certain universal capacity of reason that devises worlds, so to speak. This is, here he departs from Goodman. Goodman does not uphold the idea of a universe of worlds, only of a multiplicity, a plurality of worlds. Okay? This is just to make this point of difference between Reza and Goodman. I take this idea of a universe of worlds to be influenced by other philosophers, for instance, Lawrence Puntel, this Brazilian German philosopher that is very influential to Reza's project, that upholds the idea that you have a restricted universes of discourse and an unrestricted universe of discord enveloping these other universes. But this, we don't need to delve technically in this here, just making the point. So, and the other datum that I think it's important here is datum 5, the practical consequences of upholding thought and the artifact. I will read the datum 5. By reformatting thinking from a byproduct of material and social organization into a programmatic normative enterprise that rigorously inquires into its operational and constructive possibilities, philosophy introduces a vision of the artificial into the practice of thinking. Rather than a thought that is simply accustomed to the use of artifacts and has a concept of artificiality, this is a thought that is itself a practice of artificialization and becomes the artifact of its own ends. So here you have this kind of a loop that I was talking about, like you have a certain position within a certain world that from which you can transform it into different worlds. So the same structure is used here by Reza, like thought is kind of here, thinking is a byproduct, he says so, of material and social organization. We'll be delving in this right in a few moments, okay? But it kind of autonomizes itself into a programmatic normative enterprise that is able to, in turn, change its own conditions. The conditions that themselves gave rise to thinking can be, for Reza, modified by thinking itself. This is the basic gist of this entire presentation, but I will present it with a few caveats that are not only, you can't get them only from Reza or only from Gabriel. Okay. So, well, I don't think we need this. I can go on. So here we get to this issue. Sorry. Okay, let me just check the timing. Here we get to this issue of practice, right? So Marx on an important crossroad between saying and doing. So here is a quote from the economic philosophical manuscripts of Marx. So he says, in order to supersede the idea of private property, the idea of communism is enough. In order to supersede private property as it actually exists, real communist activity is necessary. History will give rise to such activity. And the movement, which we already know in thought to be a self-superseding movement, will in reality undergo a very difficult and protracted process. But we must look upon it as a real advance that we have gained at the outset, an awareness of the limits as well as the goal of this historical movement, and are in a position to see beyond it. When communist workmen gather together, their immediate aim is instruction, propaganda, etc. But at the same time, they acquire a new need, the need for society, and what appears as a means has become an end. This practical development can be most strikingly observed in the gatherings of French socialist workers. Smoking, eating, and drinking, etc., are no longer means of creating links between people. Company, association, conversation, which in turn has society as its goal, is enough for them. The brotherhood of men is not a hollow phrase, it is a reality, and the nobility of men shines forth upon us from their work-worn figures. So this is kind of important because, well, I'll talk about this in the next slide. Marx' quote presents a conundrum. The first paragraph differentiates between the abstract idea of communism or political practice. Here, communism means the unfolding of a certain common, okay? Like it can be in Reza's version of the equality of all minds, or it can be in this version of the freedom of thought from thinkers. Anyway, it's the idea of instantiation of a certain thinking that will have consequences upon social and material organization. Okay, so it's not really historical communism as it was done here in my presentation. But anyway, this real movement of transformation that is communism. The first paragraph differentiates between the abstract idea of communism and the concrete work of bringing it about. Its real movement. Okay. But the second paragraph offers a strange twist that Tupinambá reads as a reversal between means and ends. If in the first paragraph practice is lauded instead of theory because of its goal-orientedness towards the achievement of emancipation, the very act of organizing in the second paragraph becomes the end in itself, once workers become conscious of a need that is in a sense provided by the very sociality involved in organizing. So why is it a reversal between means and end? Because this sociality of organization becomes enough in a sense. They become conscious of a certain need for sociality that is satisfied by the sociality involved in organization. So this very need for sociality might, the end point might be the organization of society as a whole, but the organizing that is required in order to bring about this result is sufficient for them because there they have the sociality they need. So organization becomes kind of the end. The organization that was a means towards revolution becomes the end of the practice, of the practical goal. So this active movement, a painfully difficult process of liberation, which is 100 times more important than the work of philosophers sitting home, aloof, thinking of the idea of freedom, from the point of view of Marx, of course, is nonetheless suddenly interrupted or distorted by the appearance of a new need. This new need has a very peculiar structure because unlike the real estrangement of human life, which can only be superseded by the actual overcoming of private property, it can find satisfaction in the present, in the very process of socialization of workers. This new need, which is produced by the very formal dimension of the organization, the forming of workers, inverts the relation between means and ends. Rather than organize in order to accomplish certain tasks of interest for the movement, the communist workmen take part in the harsh struggle for actual communism so that they can engage in smoking, eating, and drinking in a sense, they become in their pleasure in company, association, and or conversation, like the lazy philosophers Marx had just criticized, who think of communism for the pleasure of thinking. Tupinambá's text is in many respects a meditation upon such reversal. So freeing thought from thinkers, the basic idea. I will, of course, for now, you might think this is unconnected to what I was saying about Reza, but it will be, I'll bring it all together by the end, okay? So our wager can be formulated as follows. There are ideas which can only be consistently thought of within certain forms of collective organization. That is, there are ideas which can only be properly developed if their conceptual construction is tied together with the practical construction of a given institutional space. Okay, but Tupinambá derives the concept of such a conceptual construction tied with the practical construction of an institutional space, not from the practical deontic determination of theoretical language use, such as in the Brandomian account that Reza largely accepts and develops, or Salarzan, if you prefer, but from a de facto emergence out of abstraction out of social practice that can be located in Marx's account of commodity form. So the fact is that this concept of this conceptual construction that has as is a vehicle, a kind of is brought forth by a certain organization, is akin to a certain kind of real abstraction. There are abstractions that emerge out of social practice and they gain, so to speak, causal efficacy, okay? So this is Marx's idea. Marx, sugar loaf being a body, is heavy and therefore has weight, but we can neither see nor touch this weight. We then take various pieces of iron whose weight has been determined beforehand. The iron as iron is no more the form of manifestation of weight than is the sugar loaf. Nevertheless, in order to express the sugar loaf as so much weight, we put it into weight relation with the iron. In this relation, the iron officiates as a body representing nothing but weight, which means when you get material bodies in relation one to the other and kind of reads off, you can read off a certain property out of a certain body in its relation to another, you are individualizing a kind of abstract thing there, like the property of being weighted bodies, okay, weight here. So commodity form is a kind of universalization of these equivalence relations, right? So the value of commodities, on the other hand, is inherently social, that is itself relational. Commodities, when removed from the field of exchange relations, maintain only their natural and heterogeneous determinations, those responsible for each of their use values. Like we buy a piece of bread to eat, we buy a piece of furniture to sit upon it, or whatever, to put it in our living room, something like that. Okay, so but we find there nothing to be expressed regarding value as such. This leads us to add a third remark to the previous ones, namely the fact that the homogeneity between the bodies in a given relation must be extended to the scale, the measurement itself. Physical forms are made legible by physical scales, while social forms are made legible by social scales. This thesis, which vacillates between self-evident and the obscure, allows us to determine a fundamental distinction between the natural and the social relations. For in the latter case, the being is that is comparatively measured, and the comparison itself are not only of the same consistency, but are rather indiscernible. Nothing distinguishes what it means to express the value of a commodity, and what it means for commodities to constitute their value to begin with. So there is a indiscernibility between expression and constitution, in a sense. Like you express that which constitutes. It expresses that which constitutes it. So what constitutes commodity is the value as a commodity, in other words. Social forms, such as the value form, become rational, that is, enter into relations of proportion, which make certain of its properties legible, through the very same process that renders them actual. The very being of the social relation under investigation is homogeneous and indistinguishable from the process through which its properties become legible for us. Okay. So I'll just read the last one, which has to do with which has the Zizek quote. We can recognize here a very no, maybe I'll read the middle one as well. This is kind of important. We have just examined the meta-economical hypothesis that the subject of science in political economy is not the actor of exchange, but something that is implicated and determined by the commodity form itself. Reducibly, social forms are in fact constituted by the indistinguishable point where their being and their thought mutually support each other. But such a point paradoxically does not coincide with ourselves as thinking beings. The starting point of capital is rather than there is such a thing as a social form which thinks, a form of thought that is distinct from thought in the individual sense. So this is a crucial idea of freeing thought from thinkers. What Gabriel is doing here, just to remember what is being said. It's taking out of the analysis of the commodity form the idea that there are certain abstract forms that have causal efficiency in the sense that they are moving the world around. They move us, right? That emerge from social practice, even though they are not thought by any individual participant in the social practice as a whole. We act as if, right, there are commodities, we buy and sell and all of that. But it is not the actions or the thought of any individual participant in the social sphere that give rise to commodity form, right? So this is from this, Gabriel is trying to think the possibility that there are forms of organization, of social organization, that are equivalent, let us say like that, let me put it like that, equivalent to a thinking, to a certain thought, because they make certain abstractions emerge that then have causal efficacy, something like that. And these abstractions would be irreducible to the thinking of the individual subject, okay? So it's quite different, right? From what I'm saying, the thesis of the equality of all minds as put forward by Reza is not an individual, of course, like it's not something to be thought by an individual. It is a historical process brought forward by the development of philosophy in a sense. But nevertheless, they have to do, this thesis is unfolding through the experimentation in thought itself, right? In this space of theoretical thinking. Whereas here, there is something of concrete social organizations, it's not unfolding purely in the theoretical space of thought. It is unfolding in the practical space of society, okay? From which emerges these abstract things that in turn have causal efficacy. So the point is, what kinds of organization can we come up with that will enable the right kinds of abstractions, or the kinds of abstraction that are interesting for us instead of, for instance, commodity form, right? Interesting for us here in the sense of bringing forward, putting forward, or bringing about a certain idea of political emancipation. In other words, what kinds of organization are able to think what must be thought for social emancipation. So this is the basic idea of Gabriel, the second one. But at the same time, I have my issues with this idea. The idea that here comes from this quote from Zizek, a form of thought that is distinct from thought. The starting point of capital is rather that there is such a thing as a social form which thinks, this predicate, a social form which thinks, I think has a bunch of problems involved in it. So the idea of organization that are equivalent forms of thought is very interesting to me. But the idea that they are thoughts, are thinkings, is rather problematic, because you are there confusing for me something that is a pattern-governed situation, and patterns, like patterns are ubiquitous in nature. Anywhere you see there is a pattern going on. And to think that maybe just to have an organization or to have an unfolding of a certain form of organization as a sufficient condition for having thinking, I think you're eliding an important distinction between thinking proper and just patterning, having a pattern going on. An organizational pattern that emerges from a certain set of agents or things, even things like, right? Okay. Well, if you uphold the idea of an organization that is a form of thought, it is a form of thought that is disjunct from the thought of its members, of its participants. It is thinking in the sense, which means it is, I would parse this in terms of, it is bringing forth consequences that are not predicted from the level of the individual participant. Okay. So our initial wager has been that there are ideas which are only thinkable on the condition of a practical engagement with certain forms of institutional organization. This led us as a first step to examine the notion of real abstraction at play in commodity fetishism. As we have shown, Marx's analysis of the form of value hinges on two operations: A, an indeterminability between thought and social being, insofar as a value relation which abstracts from all concrete determination of the commodities being compared. Their social being is indistinguishable from the act of comparing two commodities in order for the first to get its immaterial value expressed as the material body of the other, making value thinkable. And B, a decentrament of this coincidence in regards to thought. For the site where being and thinking are the same, this is my problem. Being and thinking are the same. I think you can uphold something like that, but there are some caveats to do it. Okay, you have to make some distinctions. All it takes place negatively. It is not that we as participants of the act of exchange think, but rather the thought implicated in the very social form of our practices. This initial investigation led us to recognize that there is a kind of reality whose very ontological consistency implies a certain non-knowledge of its participants. That is, social being is conditioned by an abstraction, which it also produces, but this thought takes place outside and despite of us. This is the basic form of the organization that is being discussed here by Gabriel. Getting to the end, I guess in the next 20 minutes I'll finish. So on Badiou and thinking, what this means is that in order to understand the new place of thinking in a circle where a certain indifference to thought is promoted, we need a theory of ideas which would allow us to state that while the individual participants of a collective might be busy with their private concerns, the very institution they compose goes on thinking in that sense, okay? There is perhaps no other philosopher today more equipped to supplement our Zizekian theory of social forms, of collective forms in which there is thought outside of thinking subjects, than Alain Badiou and his theory of political ideas. For Badiou, thinking is not a particularly conscious or unconscious activity. Its principal property is to produce and maintain an immanent indifference to its given domain. Okay, I think this is sufficient from this. I'm just trying to go a little bit faster. So in Tupinambá's work, the knowledge one has as a member of a collective does not coincide with the knowledge that is of the collective, so to speak, that in its indifferent unfolding instantiates a thinking in which the members are participating. A given chair participates in the idea of a chair. Its multiple being is seen as one from the standpoint of the idea of which it partakes. This is kind of a Platonist concept of participation, okay? This could lead us to assume that to participate in an idea, in the case of a political organization, would mean to treat the actual concrete organization as a local case, and our apprehension of it, or our imagination of its ideal version, as the form. But what we get is rather the opposite. the organization itself in the indifferent or negative universality of the formalism it embodies is rather what carries traits of a general or generic idea, and those who are formed by it, workers, ignorant men, etc., are the multiple, unified from the standpoint of the social formation. Participation becomes, for Badiou, the name of an immanent mediation between two regions of the world, a set of determined beings and a practical formalism which differs from its determined situation. Okay, so form becomes content. This text by Gabriel also describes a certain set of axioms of practice that organizes the Circle of Studies of the Idea and Ideology, CSII, that Lika mentioned in when she read my bio. I was a member of this. It's not that I'm not a member anymore, but the collective became a different thing now. So it's even not called CSII anymore. But then there was a very interesting kind of set of rules that organized this circle, because the idea was to have kind of a circle, a political collective that should not be organized around the ideas of leftist identity. For the whole point of these formal procedures was to be indifferent to what the individuals that are entering the circle think of the world. If they have a leftist position or a right-wing one, this should be indifferent, because the material that was organized by the circle was organization itself. It wasn't any individual sense of any proposition, any belief of anybody that is in this. So in order for this to come about, there were a set of formal protocols that you had to follow if you were part of the circle. So there are, let me see, four things. An entry form. So in order to join the group, one has to fill an admittance form divided in two sections, one demanding objective information about the candidate, another asking for the proponent to write a commentary on the circle's project. The interesting idea is that you could write anything as long as you wrote something. We weren't judging what were your ideas about the circle. There was no consideration of validity of the ideas you had about the circle. The criteria was formal in the sense that if you wrote a commentary, you were in. Even if you wrote a commentary, I hate this circle, this is bullshit, whatever, you were in because you wrote a commentary as the form insisted. So this was a formal criteria. Second point, B, permanence. However, the entry form is not a determining operator of belonging in the circle's logic. So you had to have an operator saying that you still belong. Once you entered, you answered the form, and now I belong. But how do I know if I still belong, if I have a continuous belonging? So rather than deriving consistency from a mechanism that distinguishes the inside from the outside of the collective, the circle relies on a different protocol which privileges the connection of one meeting to the next, the work note. So we had meetings. These meetings could be a monthly meeting or a weekly meeting to discuss whatever actions we are involved with, okay? And everybody who is in the meeting has to provide a work note, has to write whatever. It is also a formal protocol. There's no specific subject, there's no specific thing that must be treated in the note. Anything goes. At one point, I was in debt. I had to write like 4 notes because I was in debt. It's been 4 meetings since I didn't write a note. I just wrote, I owe you 4 notes, five different notes like that. And this is sufficient. It's only a formal protocol, which means you have, you can already see that it is a set of different procedures that kind of evict content. We don't really need the content. We are not judging the content. Of course, once the note is done and you send the note, the next meeting will discuss your note. And you can discuss anything in your note, really, even your own individual problems. But the point is, there is no mandatory content to be dealt with in the note. It can be anything. In the circle, the indeterminate space created by the purely formal character of the work notes produces a similar absence, which is equally followed by a certain form of transferential work, of displacements and suppositions concerning other members and the group itself. This enactment or realization of transference ultimately allows the circle to treat some of its obstacles and the other who would be responsible for such interdictions as objects of interpretation, even though there is no one in the position of an analyst. Okay? As it turned out, the analytic effects in a collective need to be formally homogeneous with the site of their intervention. So yeah, so here you go. The idea is the way you are behaving with the work notes is information, and the choice you make about what to put in the work note, since we are not telling you what to put in the work note, are indicative of how you are seeing the organizational process itself. How do you interpret the demand for a work note that otherwise has no other determination? I say it is as if it is almost as a psychoanalytical procedure. Like you go to the meeting with your analyst and you have to say something, and there is nothing determining what you have to say. You say something, and the fact that what you choose to say is such and such is indicative of your subjective position with regard to this analyst, and in the circle with regard to the organization and to what's going on. Okay, so then position. Then there's a position. This is not very important for us. The constitution of a circle cell requires that there will be at least 2 people, the +1 and the secretary. Okay, the rest is not that important. I think these abstract procedures are what's important here. The practical instantiation of the idea of having an organization that, by its formal unfolding, will give us information about its members and about itself, what kind of results it can bring about. Okay, because it's not tethered to a specific objective. So this is also the connection to the Marx quote, like the sociality itself is not here means to an end, but it is the end itself, constructing the sociality within this immanent space, okay, which is an interesting thing. So, and constructing a sociality within this immanent space is here thought of as a form of thinking. So this will be my addition to this problem. So as I said before, the redefinition of the problem of world making from inside worlds and patterns. From this point of view, we are able to articulate a version of the problem of world making that might have more interesting consequences for political action. Initially, I had said that worlds are already inhabited in Goodman's sense. The eviction of one ready-made world entails that we already inhabit multiple worlds that is of our own making. But this inhabitation is thought of as the way worlds appear, and their refashioning are thought of by Goodman as the workings of a subject that is able to logically elaborate these appearances. So if we get back to the quote, the Goodman quote that I use, like the sun never moves or the sun always moves. Of course, these are appearances, and you can create a coherent web by coming up with truth candidates in the sense of Reza, right? That elaborate and creates these 2 different world versions. Okay, but this is an epistemological point of view. I am here organizing what appears to me. But what if I am the material of the organization that is being reorganized? So the question of inhabitation of worlds becomes problematic once we are not thought of as the creators of worlds, but the material with which worlds are made. And here the political question of organization gets its traction. Elaboration from inside means then remaking the world I live in, both as an agent and as material that is subjected to the remaking. Okay? I'm getting to the end now. While Reza's account might be sufficiently fine-grained regarding the conceptual unfoldings of thinking, the demand for the concrete emancipation of minds might fall back in Marx's indictment of the idea of communism against the concrete movement of abolition of what is that demands the point of view of the material agent, not only of the logical agent of change. Tupinambá's or Gabriel's text, while putting forward important constraints regarding the rational consequences of concrete organizations, elides, in our point of view, important distinctions between being and being subjected to patterns and thinking proper, which demands the participation of language. The face-off between both points of view yields a version of Sellers' inconsistent triad. Here is more for people who read Sellers. I won't get much into this unless somebody from the audience asks me about this inconsistent triad, but this is I think it's quite interesting. A, the organizational patterning of X implies that X is a thinking. Okay, this is kind of the Zizek'ian hypothesis, Badiouian hypothesis, right? So B, patternings of behavior are subject independent. They just happen. Okay, you don't need to be thinking them. They are just pure happenings. Okay, nobody's thinking them up. C, seeing patternings as thinkings is subject dependent. So once you see the unfolding of the organization as akin to a form of thought, this is subject dependent. Even if the organization is giving rise to abstractions that are not under the constraints of the individual subject, thinking subject, the recognition of this is subject dependent. You have to have like rational agents in order to integrate those patterns that might be too complex for a single subject to come up with them, but then they become integrated into a theoretical assessment as well. That might function as a normative prescription to act in a certain way. So, as in the Sellers' inconsistent triad that you can read in Empiricism and Philosophy of Mind, maintaining A and C implies non-B, maintaining A and B implies non-C, maintaining B and C implies non-A. In my view, A is to be rejected. You can't really think that just an organizational pattern implies thinking by itself. So there you go. This is my basic issue with the way Gabriel is construing this from Zizek and Badiou, even though I accept every other consequence of his paper. Okay, so content becomes form. While Badiou's conception of thinking is adopted precisely for its disjunction between the knowledge of the participant and the knowledge of the organization, we can extract from Tupinambá's text itself a possible answer to the difference between pattern and thinking, mobilizing a distinction between constructivist, what he calls constructivist and experimental endeavors engaged by the circle. Tupinambá comments, the circle lacked the knowledge of how to distinguish the investigative activity of an idea from the constructivist engagement with an ideal that was simply not that of the institution at stake. However, insofar as this experiment was not attempted for the sake of proving the circle's own ideal apprehension of itself, so that its failure would put the collective's real leftism in question, but rather with the aim of verifying if it was possible to export the circle's fundamental wagers into new contexts, this failure was homogeneous with the circle's organization, internal to it. Because this experiment composed the trajectory of a thinking, it was later at the disposal of its member as a challenge for thought. So the non-identity between what you think you are doing and what the organization is doing, the failure for our leftist identities, our self-understanding as leftists, to integrate what the organization is itself doing is relevant information for the organization and could be maybe mobilized by other organizations. So there is a second moment wherein the results of the organization watching itself are extracted by participants, even in the form of a failure, of a gap, which is then fed back into the thinking of the organizational practice. And this is why it is a thinking, okay? This amounts for us to the passage between being or instantiating a pattern and thinking proper, that is, seeing something as something that is possible to locate within a conceptual framework. I don't think we need this. While Reza's project takes forms of life as analogous to bundles of rules to be decoded and recoded in accordance to both the concept of the human as subjectable to elaboration and of intelligence as the extraction of intelligibilities, it remains tethered to the theoretical space, even though, of course, as a philosopher, this can be mobilized in order to bring about practical consequences in the form of certain instantiations, but this is almost like a second moment of implementation of this thinking, right? The experimental point of view proposed by Gabriel supposes the formation of patterns in practical organization to be integrated in our symbolizing practice and further tinkered with. This is my take of it, of course. Gabriel usually talks about the organization thinking itself. So I usually think this goes about more as a cybernetic process between the participant and the organization, even if the unfolding of organization is superseding the participants' individual conceptual powers, which is why the experimental approach is important here. So these patterns may function like epistemological mediators and or cybernetic filters, extensions of our logical means of world making and life forming. Yeah, I think we don't really need this. This is something about Brazilian philosophy that I'm working on, José Arthur Gianotti, that is trying to bring together some materialist Marxist philosophy with the philosophy of the forms of life in the sense of Wittgenstein. This was just to show that the logical elaboration of forms of life, as I think about it, as Reza thinks about it, as in a certain sense, Gabriel thinks about it, they are also materially embedded. They are material things that function as criteria for the language games in which we play. But I don't think we really need this right now. I think I talked enough. So I think I'll just stop here.
Thanks a lot. Now we can proceed to some questions. All the participants that are now in a Zoom session, you can also ask questions. We can,
I believe Nina, in order to ask a question, I saw a little hand here coming up. So
yes, but I think you can unmute yourself by yourself too.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll just talk about ask something about the last part about organizational practices and about that type of operation which is central to the picture of organization, how it sees itself. JP, could you please elaborate? Did I get it right that that the organization has a form similar to the form of Geist in Hegel's phenomenology of spirit. There, in Hegel, we have two parts of intelligence, two types of Geist. One is absolute and one is concrete, we can say. And the absolute Geist allows concrete Geist to see itself from outside of it, and that two types of Geists, they form some process of recognition, the thinking subject. Yes. You talked about Hegel too, and you talked about when you talked about the collective, you said that the collective has some forms of recognition of itself too. Are they similar to that structure, or it's something else?
I think its format is similar in the sense that Geist demands participation, and the means by which Geist sees itself demands the individual mind that is part of Geist, right? Like Geist needs us in the given sense. So maybe my argument, I think you located something there. I actually might build something out of your question, because maybe my argument is to uphold what Gabriel is proposing, and I was a member of the group. I think I agree with the consequence of that approach. But at the same time, it seems that it's not just the group unfolding that is thinking. The group is unfolding and thinking through the thinking of its members. And this is not the same as saying that the group is the result of the thinking of the members. Like, I think some idea in my head and I implement it. And then the group is the realization of the idea I had in my head. No, this is not it. The group is independent. It's got an independent unfolding, but this unfolding is at once recognized as a form of thinking only if you have participants who are thinking it, who are watching it and coming up with hypotheses and conclusions regarding it. And also the fact that we are continuously thinking it feeds back, of course, to the result that the organization is giving. And these results, typically, it's also non-identical to the idea that I might have about a result, which is quite interesting. There's this failure of, well, there are consequences that I didn't think beforehand. There's something going on, something weird going on there that I don't recognize as what I intended. But this gap is also information, and this can also be related to Hegel under a certain kind of reading. For instance, don't know if you read The Dash by Rebecca Comey and Frank Ruda. They have this interpretation that for Hegel the failure is as important as the realization. The failure between, one instance of understanding and the results and the geistig result that there is there, that's going on there. This is informative itself. So yeah, it's a quite interesting question. I think it's got some formal a formal community in a sense. It's got the same form as Hegelian philosophy. At the same time, it's a localization of that, because organization, of course, is not Geist. The organization is a specific organization, a specific corpus of people that are together working on this sociality and coming up with solutions for certain problems. So it's not Geist, it is a localized practice, local in the sense that it's not, of course, the whole of history or the whole of mankind, but it's got this same strange relationship that Geist has with the Geistisch, the Geistisch being, like the human that is thinking, right? But it is localized in a sense. So you can't really say that. Of course, the consequences that we get as a group are the same consequence that any group will get. But this has to be filtered by different collectives, right? The consequence should be filtered by different collectives and use maybe the circle as a particular experiment in organization. So there's a kind of particularity in this that's not as universal as, you know, of course, Hegel thinks in his case, right? Did I answer you? You're muted, Lika.
Yeah, thanks a lot. It really, maybe your project aims at describing the ways of ideology as a process, as an operational thing, and it's just funny that when I myself was in political organizations, we talked about we were taught that in that organization there happens an ideology indoctrination in us. Just like you said, that there is a Marxist theoretician, and he basically gives us the Marxist framework, and he instantiates it in the circle, in the organization, and here it is. Really, with what you just said, we see that that model doesn't really work, because it's indifferent to the people in the organization to concrete thinking processes which are present there too.
I think I can answer to that, also answering what Nina wrote here. She wrote a question also in the chat bar that has something to do with this.
Can I read it, mate? Can I read?
Yeah, I'll read it just to have it recorded. On organizational practices, this might be a simple question, but the organizational practice is written as if there's harmony within the group. It is difficult to imagine the participants having a fight. It seems like the people get along just fine enough not to stir any trouble with each other voluntarily. So how this philosophy accounts for the conflict within the organization? How can we think about conflict? So in a sense, it's interesting because the model you just, the model you just proposed is like a content-based model, so to speak, right? You have to believe certain set of things, and so you're part of a collective, and your participation is measured by the point up to which you believe what you have to believe. You have to believe this and that. So this was absent in this organization, in a sense. It is predicated upon a suspension of this idea, at least in theory, not necessarily in practice, because of course it is an organization made up of people, so there may be certain results that come about because a majority thinks like this and not like that. But this is not, this effect is not part of the way the organization, the model of the organization functions, right? because typically a political organization have a set of beliefs that you have to uphold, and not in this case. So conflict is a part of it. I'm sorry to maybe not have been clear enough about this, but conflict was always a part of it, because precisely because you don't have to uphold any idea, specific idea. You don't have to do anything other than formal protocols. So it's quite weird, because in this model we are obliged to do meaningless gestures. It's like bureaucracy. We are for bureaucracy in a sense, because this bureaucracy that is voided of content enables content to appear. Because if you are demanding content, certain other content won't appear. But if you just need to fill a certain set of gratuitous behaviors, purely formal ones, certain contents might appear, and contents that are not welcomed by everyone. And this was always something to be discussed in the meetings. So conflict was always a part of this. I mean, at least formally. Of course, there are cases of people that, in the end, were not comfortable enough to stay in the organization. Such was the nature of the conflict that was created. This happened, but in a certain sense, comparatively, it is a group that was active for almost 10 years, and this is quite a lot for a leftist organization, because leftist groups are very well known for dividing very quickly because of this kind of conflict. Exactly. So these protocols, I think, even if they are not able, and now just answering to Nina, they are not able to avoid that maybe somebody wants to leave the group, the collective. This happens, but in a sense, I think they enable much longer stay and much more diverse ways of addressing these kinds of conflict than in content-based collectives that demand that you believe such and such and behave in such and such ways, you see. So yes, conflict is part of the material. So this kind of this gap that I was mentioning also again to Lika because of the question on Hegel, this gap between the individual and the results of the organization is also a gap between what different individuals think the organization is doing and the results of the organization. So there's a three-way gap, really. There's a gap between each one of the individuals, their projections of what the organization is actually doing, and the result of the organization. And the fact that we are not treating this as we recognize the failure, but failure here becomes the name of a certain structural relationship. It's not something, oh my God, we are not being communist enough, let us shoot our heads. No, we are not being communist enough. Okay, this is data. Let's talk about this. Why? What's going on? Is it possible to be communist enough? This becomes a working question, for instance. This is just an example I come up with. Maybe it's not possible. So what's possible? What's not possible? Why is it not possible? For instance, at some point, there was a problem of the militancy and the time you had to give to militancy, because you had already very long work hours, most of the members, and now I have to come here and be a militant. How come? So this was also an issue. The work dedicated to political action, is this work? Is this free time? You have to dedicate your free time to political action, or is this should be counted as work hours? So there's a set of different questions that emerge from these kinds of conflict. Exactly. Somebody who starts not coming to the meetings, and we were, hey hey person, what's going on? Why are you not coming to the meeting? And then there's a problem, and then this gets fed back to the group. Of course, there is also a limit. The limit has to do with maybe the limits of the involved people. So there are people who, well, I'm not interested in this anymore, and they left the group. This happens, of course. This is not a universal panacea for such cases. But nevertheless, the fact is that formally we are treating conflict as material, not as a failure of material. Failure is a material itself. So this was something that was very interesting to me in this collective. Did I answer, Dina? Lika and Nina, because I kind of answered you both together. Okay. So anybody else?
When you talked about that meeting a person on the street, I thought that it would be convenient to maybe say hello, phenomenon self-model. Do you see any connection between that eliminativist project? Yes, the project
Okay,
of
that's right. Okay.
having no personality. Yes, and the model of thinking proposed by sellers, maybe in your slide about sellers that free you have three dots, and the first dot was about was something which you proposed to eliminate. Was it the individual thinking, or it was just some kind of...
There's two questions there, right? Let me address each one separately. The first one was if there is a relationship between, if I'm not, correct me if I'm wrong, okay? I'm just trying to understand your question. First one was if there is a relationship between kind of eliminativist or maybe Metzingerian project in the philosophy of mind and this kind of thinking or rationality or political ideas, right? And the second one had to do with what was that I was proposing with my inconsistent triad, okay? So this second one, I will share the slide again just to make it clear. But the first one was about Metzinger. So yeah, Metzinger has this idea, just for the people who didn't read it, has this idea that what you take to be yourself, like your personality, your phenomenal self, which means that self that appears to you as being yourself, okay, is the result of this is the result of the processing of your neural system, okay. This is the idea. So there is actually no one there, so to speak. There is a kind of processing, and it is less costly informationally to have a phenomenal self model than to not have a phenomenal self model. A phenomenal self model gives you a perspective under which to look at the world. Otherwise, it's just a blind process and all of that. So this is very crude, okay? Of course, Metzinger is very sophisticated, so this is very crude. Yeah, I think there is some possible connection there because we are putting, in a sense, in this project, we are kind of, both of them, in Reza's project and in the project of the circle, there is a kind of suspension of one phenomenality and the phenomenality of the self, in a sense. We are dealing with the rational unfoldings of a logical subject, so to speak, right? because in Reza's project, it is about, the ways of world making that a logical agent can come up with as logical environments with which understand the world, okay? And in the case of the circle, of course, we are not avoiding that people have their phenomenal self-models of their personalities, but we are kind of addressing things not from that point of view, but from the point of view of abstract organization. So, but this abstract organization is not neural work either. It's a different thing, right? So there is something in common with this kind of suspension of individual phenomenal subjectivity in the circle that is in the circle, but not with the same means and in the same way and with the same, I would say, it's not even the same subject, the same approach than Metzinger, because Metzinger is talking about individual agents when he talks about this, and we are not talking about individual agents, we are talking about a collective agency. But what I think that this has in common is the fact that this collective agency is not constituted through the affective phenomenal elements of the participants exclusively. What is demanded is abstract, but what it appears might be the result of personality and phenomenal selves and emotions and all that. Of course, this becomes material as well. But the fact is, we are not believing it. Maybe this is what it has in common with Metzinger. We are not believing it as like the fundamental judge of reality. We think that there is a certain abstract way to organize things that might make these affective, emotional elements not inessential, but quite on the contrary, will make them appear. But in order for them to appear as that, they can't be really the drivers of the process. The process must be done. This driving must be, this plotting, must be done elsewhere with other elements. Okay, I think that would be my first answer. The second one, that about the inconsistent triad. Let me go back there. Okay, so Seller's inconsistent triad is not that, of course. I just created something that has the same form as Seller's inconsistent triad, because I think to uphold that the organization is doing the thinking is a kind of metaphorical way of talking, in a sense that is eliding the distinction between a pattern and thinking. For Sellers, patterns are ubiquitous. Everything is instantiating a pattern. Every causal process is instantiating a pattern without necessarily being thought, being an example of thought. To be a thought, you have to have a certain, more than that, even though thought are also cases of patterns. But only patterns simpliciter, only patterns, this is not sufficient to have thought. So what I am proposing is that the idea that organizational patterning of X implies X is a thinking, I would reject this one. I would reject A, because I mean, organizational patterning, if I just throw my books here in the table, in the floor, there will be a pattern. And this is not necessarily a case of thinking, right? So just to have a certain unfolding of an organization is not sufficient to say that this organization is actually thinking. It might be just another case of a causal process. And I am inclined to think that the Marxist analysis of real abstraction, for instance, is not a case of thinking. It's just a case of emergence of a different scale within a causal process. So I would resist calling it thinking, okay? And this is what I was rejecting, that just patterns, having patterns is thinking. But I would save all the things that Gabriel is saying by upholding B and C. Patternings of behavior are subject independent, which means you have an organization. People are behaving. There is an emergent pattern that is not under the purview of any individual subject, which means no individual subject is controlling the resulting pattern. So this is what B means. It's subject independent. Subject here in the sense of an individual subject. And seeing patternings as thinkings is subject dependent, which is my C, which means, of course, there is a pattern going on that is not a thinking. It's just a pattern, a result of causal processes, okay, that emerge from the behavior of agents, but no individual agent is thinking them up, okay. But seeing these patterns as a form of thinking, which means I'm attributing this pattern as a form of thinking because I am participating in an organization, this is subject dependent, which means I need to have language using creatures and, you know, conscious creatures in order to see this pattern and attribute it the thinking character, which means it is something that is plottable. We can intervene in this patterning. Once we can intervene in this patterning, we can think of it as a kind of thinking that is asubjective, that is non-individual. So upholding B and C is a way to save all the theses of freeing thought from thinkers without necessarily saying that it follows from having the organization and an organization unfolding and just indifference between certain formalism and its place of unfolding. This is sufficient to say that it is a form of thinking. I would resist this first formulation. I would uphold B and C, and I would say further that B and C is sufficient to have to save all the theses of the CSII. Okay. This was my basic gist of it. And by doing this in that way, I am compatibilizing, I think I am compatibilizing this Badiouian kind of understanding with a Sellarsian one that demands a further requirement in order to have thought. It can't be just patterns, right? Just to have a pattern. It can't be just that. Did I answer?
I'm muted. No, not. Yes, thank you. I think we should end our session now because there it's 10 p.m. already.
Okay, yeah, 10 p.m. there. Okay. Here it's the middle of the afternoon, so yeah.
Yeah, so I think it was great. We are very happy to have you here. And we'll end the session now.